Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Stone and Chalk webinar event, ChatGPT and AI for HR, Transforming Recruitment. We're excited to get underway now with our AI expert host, Ben Dunn. So Ben, over to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Blake. Hello, everybody. Thank you for attending this webinar today. I think I have you for about an hour. I have about 100 slides to get through, and they're not particularly dense. It's just I know that people I need to kind of keep their attention, and so you will see from the slides it's not going to be too onerous, but hopefully I can distract you from Slack or whatever else that you're trying to do while watching this. So let me just kind of start a little bit of an introduction about Stone and Chalk in terms of who we are. We started in 2014 as a co-working space, particularly focused on fintech. Since that time, we've grown to 250 startups, more than 250, 6,000 residents across 4 different hubs, covering 40 different tech types, at least 40 different. So things have kind of changed a fair amount. So now we're much more of a kind of an innovation ecosystem business than we were when we started. I am a member of the Stone and Chalk advisory team. We help companies to imagine what's next in terms of emerging technology like ChatGPT and generative AI, do something about it, because it's all well and good with technology emerging, but the real winners are going to be the ones who change their business models and change their businesses as a result. And sometimes that means partnering with the startups who are building things and can help you disrupt in your space. In terms of the chat, we have Kira today, and I think Kim is also there, and they are there to handle any queries or questions you have throughout. Any questions that you have that need answering, we have got some time at the end. From experience of doing these before, given all of the slides, it depends how long I go on. That tends to be about 5-10 minutes maximum, so please bear with us. Who is today for? Clearly, it's for recruitment and HR professionals. But that said, it's very, very difficult with something like this to know how much experience and expertise people have with generative AI. So I find that it's useful to try and kind of show people where this is aimed at. So it's certainly not the beginners, the people who've never used ChatGPT. It's certainly not experts, because we know that data scientists sometimes sign up to this, I guess, just to see how the other half live. This is actually aimed at people who are AI curious, the people in the middle. So you've used it and you want to know how to apply it to recruitment. So clearly, one of the reasons why we've chosen recruitment as a part of HR is that this is a survey from Josh Bersin. He has from this survey, it is quite clear that talent acquisition is an extremely important part of HR practice, which I'm sure will be clear to all of you. So in terms of kind of looking at the impact of generative AI on HR is an enormous area. So what we try to do is to focus in on recruitment, and even that is enormous by itself. So let's just kind of set the scene a little bit. And again, my apologies for this. I'm not a recruitment professional, but what I'm trying to do with all of this is to kind of imagine, use my knowledge of generative AI and ChatGPT and other technologies like it to imagine what that might do and how that might help my understanding of recruitment. So this is a graph that I'm sure you're all familiar with in terms of the kind of the standard employee life cycle, going from start to contribution to decision to leave to last day. And so what we're trying to do is to really kind of extend that and increase the return on investment by hiring better people. And if you hire people who are more suited to the job, they stay for longer, and therefore that return on investment is higher. Our thesis is that there is an enormous contribution that AI can provide in dealing with the volume game. And what we mean by that volume is that kind of everything that you see kind of under the water there in terms of the unadvertised roles, the candidates who aren't looking, the square pegs, people where, there's a lot of kind of emphasis today on cognitive diversity and other forms of diversity and inclusion, rightly so. And so how do we capture that? because it's not for want of trying. It's like not that anybody that you may recognize this was kind of criticized very much at the time of the Republican Party. This was all their interns, and there's an awful lot of kind of white faces there. So no one's trying to make it that way, or at least I don't think they were, but the outcome can be much the same. Now, just to kind of declare my hand a little bit, I am very much a generalist. This is one of my favorite books about generalists because it talks about how people like me triumph in a specialist world. And one of the things that I believe is that instead of trying to kind of fit people like me into round holes, I think something that generative AI can help to do is to understand the needs of an organization in terms of the talent they need, and then understand the available talent in the marketplace. And just because somebody, if it's a product role, just because somebody hasn't done product for their entire career, or they've done different things, doesn't necessarily mean they're not right for a particular role. So I think there is a contribution that generative AI can do to deal with that sort of diversity and that kind of volume. So in terms of kind of there are key questions for both the candidate side and the recruiter side in terms of strategic and tactical. I'm not going to go through each one of these, but all of these questions can be supported and assisted and sometimes answered by generative AI. And so that's what I wanted to talk about today. But I wanted to talk about it very much in a kind of a Karate Kid kind of way. Now, I realize this is now an old film, and the guy on the left is now in his 60s. But nevertheless, the metaphor still stands. The Karate Kid, when he goes to Mr. Miyagi on the right-hand side, he asks if he can teach him karate so he can deal with the bullies in his life. And Mr. Miyagi makes him wax cars and then wax off and then paint the fence and then paint the fence up and down. And none of this seems to be connected to karate until right at the end, when he gets attacked by Mr. Miyagi and he says, wax on, wax off, or paint the fence, whatever. He realizes that all of those kind of things that he's been doing over the previous time have led him to a place where he can actually do karate. It was all about muscle memory. So that's what I'm going to try to do today, is to sort of talk about ways in which generative AI can be used, but then pretty much kind of leave it up to you as to how you will use it in your job. So I've got three key messages today. First of all, generative AI changes the way we work at a very fundamental level. And I'm sure you've seen a lot of that kind of reference in the press. Secondly, I believe generative AI should lead to better recruitment for everybody. And what I mean by that is better for your clients, better for agencies, and better for the candidates. And lastly, there are significant opportunities available to people who adopt this early. And when I say people, I mean businesses, but also I mean individuals. Because I think a lot of the productivity increases that we see talked about is going to come from individuals who apply this type of stuff to their everyday work and their everyday challenges. So let's talk about this first thing about how generative AI changes work at a fundamental level. The first thing is a piece of good news, which is this is built for normal people. You don't have to code things. It's not even as difficult as using Google. You can use whole sentences. And therefore, when we're thinking about generative AI, we should think Jarvis, not Skynet. You know, there's an awful lot of stuff around in the press about how it could kill us all and it's the end of the human race. There is an extremely small chance that that's where this goes. But the amount of benefit that this comes from, you may have seen articles from McKinsey recently. There was a great one from Mark Andreessen, who's from Andreessen Horowitz, the VC in California, detailing exactly how much benefit AI can provide. And where I believe it will manifest itself in our everyday lives in the coming months and years is much more like Jarvis in the way that Iron Man uses Jarvis in the films. And I think another key message is that this is a technology that floats all boats, unless you're not using it every day. So I think if you are using it, it has the potential to turn somebody who's good into somebody great. If anything, the people who are great already are going to no longer be as lonely as they have been. But even then, if they use AI, everything gets raised to another level. Now, this is the latest in a long line of kind of emerging techs where the tech industry has kind of greeted this as, well, oh, this changes everything. You know, the last thing was Web3 and crypto. And therefore, what's different this time? The first thing is just the sheer speed that people have adopted this. So you can see here in terms of the number of days that Instagram and Spotify took to get to 1 million users was 75 and 150 days, whereas for GPT, it's 5 days. And that's because one of many reasons, but that's mainly because there's no infrastructure needed. There's no pipes. There's no different device that you need to get. So there's nothing. Everybody has what they need in their pockets, and that includes the 6.6 billion people who have smartphones in the world today. If you have a smartphone and a data contract, you can use this stuff. What makes the difference, though, is how you use it. Now, there's a guy called Chris Dixon who also works for Andreessen Horowitz in California. He talks about skeuomorphism. And skeuomorphism is essentially where you take a new technology and then you apply it in old ways. So, for instance, in this picture, when TV first came out, broadcast TV, people took cameras and pointed them on a fixed tripod at a theater stage because they hadn't really questioned the assumption, and they didn't realize that they could move the camera around, they could do close-ups, they could zoom. There was all sorts of things that they could do with this technology. So what they were doing was just applying it in the old way, in the same way as on radio, when broadcast radio first started, people were reading newspapers over the radio, because that is an application, I should say, of that new technology, but it wasn't really the revolutionary application, which required some level of kind of questioning assumptions. Now, you may have seen some Goldman Sachs research that was launched, I think, back in March, that talked about a quarter of current tasks could be automated by AI in the US and Europe. They were also talking about how something like 44% of professional services could be impacted by AI. And that impact word is important to understand because it sounds bad, because impact does tend to be bad. But in actual fact, when you read the report, what they were talking about was that the impact may be beneficial, or it could be that it took something that was currently being done at volume and automated it or made it better. So that kind of a lot of the stuff that you see in the press, you really do have to take with a pinch of salt. Because fundamentally, there's this great quote from this guy from IBM: AI might not replace your, whoops, I just moved the poll out of the way. AI might not replace managers, but the managers that use AI will replace the managers that do not, which is the point I'm trying to make. Everybody, or the audience here, certainly, it's down to you. It's not that you should be waiting for somebody to give it to you, like a tool or something like that. This is something which is enormously empowering. People talk about democratizing expertise, and therefore it is available to everybody. But fundamentally, the productivity gains from AI, as per this quote from the Financial Times, are going to be earned by whoever has the wits or motivation to deploy them. And that is at a business level. So there's all sorts of things that businesses can do right now. And we get a sense that people are kind of hanging back, waiting to see, you know, what they could or should be using it for. And I understand that kind of reticence, but at the same time, this is a matter of kind of getting out there and experimenting with it and see what it can do. Because AI has changed a lot. I worked for a startup called Daisy back in 2017 that deals with contact center software and applying AI in such a way that you can ensure that an entire contact center is compliant with regulations or compliant with brand. And at that time, there was a big distinction between structured and unstructured data. And one of the innovations from generative AI is that that's no longer as important as it used to be. So something like generative AI can deal with audio or images or words, and certainly it helps if the data is structured like a spreadsheet, but it's not necessarily as important as it used to be in order for an algorithm to operate. AI is definitely increasing productivity of knowledge workers. So this is an example of some data around coding for developers, where Microsoft in September last year, they introduced a Copilot into GitHub. which is a tool used by developers. And so GitHub is now responsible for, I think, approaching 50% of all code on GitHub. What they found is that a human plus AI is 55% more productive than a human without it. So the AI is augmenting the developers and raising them to be better developers. Now, in terms of kind of the way that AI works, traditional programming has kind of this is a massive generalization, so please don't kill me, but essentially it deals with a set of kind of if this then that statements. And if you think about the way that autonomous cars might work, they have to understand the context and the environment they're in, and they have to then adjust their behavior accordingly. And if they were dealing with code in the traditional sense, they'd have to be going through millions of lines of code to find the line of code that says, what happens if a child runs in front of me? And obviously, it can't do that, because by the time it's found the relevant line of code, there's a risk that it will have knocked down the child, or it will have done something that it really that is bad. So where AI is different, and where kind of autonomous cars behave differently, is that what it tries to do is to kind of, based on its training, based on everything that it has been shown, what it tries to do is to say, what would a human driver do in this particular situation? And then it's dealing with probabilities. There's one of my favorite analysts around emerging technologies, a guy called Ben Evans, who's worth following on Twitter and signing up for his newsletter. But what he said was, large language models do not answer questions. They create things that look like answers to questions, that look like your question. And the example he gives is that if he asks ChatGPT to tell him who Benedict Evans is and give some detail, he will get a response which looks like something that someone like Ben Evans would do. And then, because it's dealing with probabilities, it's not interrogating a database like LinkedIn or something that then gives a consistent answer. So that means that every time Ben Evans asks for who is Ben Evans, he will get a slightly different answer. And that's a really, really important thing to understand when you're dealing with something like ChatGPT, because people are coming to grief because they think that it is factual. And because it sounds like it's using complete sentences and paragraphs, it seems very trustworthy. But you really, really need to be very careful when you're dealing with anything that's looking like facts, because this is where this concept called hallucinations come in. And ChatGPT, that's the big weakness at the moment, is that because it sounds correct, people think that it's right. And there's a lawyer in New York who you may have heard of, Steve Schwartz, who tried to kind of get ChatGPT to write a brief for him that he then presented to the judge. And it turned out that the cases that it was citing were completely made up, even though Stephen actually said, are these real cases? And ChatGPT said, yes, but didn't provide any kind of source as to where the ChatGPT got it from. That's what we call a hallucination. So generative AI has a wide range of applications, as long as you know how to ask the question. So it can explain, it can imagine, it can write, it can convert, and all of these things can be massively powerful. But as I say in the bottom right-hand corner of this slide, you have to stay away from facts unless it really is connected to a database. So you may have heard of this concept of the plugins that ChatGPT, OpenAI, launched back in March. And the theory with those is that it gives ChatGPT access to those databases that I was talking about before. So the idea is that it gives it a tunnel where it can kind of reach through the API, interrogate something like Kayak, and then bring the answer back into ChatGPT and then present it to the user. I was talking to a data scientist friend of mine over the weekend, and he said, yes, that does improve the response. But even then, it's still dealing with probabilities. So even then, the response from ChatGPT still cannot be trusted if you're dealing with facts. So that's a very, very important thing to understand when you're dealing with generative AI and ChatGPT and trying to kind of decide what you're going to ask it. So let's move to generative AI leading to better recruitment for everybody. There are various ways how AI can help with recruitment. And, you know, one of the fun things to do is to ask ChatGPT how it can help with recruitment. And usually it comes out with a list of about 8 to 10 ways. And you can ask it to just keep going. You can ask it to continue, and it will keep giving you long lists of ways in which AI can help you with recruitment. So I'm certainly not going to deal with that here. But I do think that there are key things that AI can uniquely do, one of which is routine volume. So things like screening resumes is something which is kind of bread and butter. But I think the other point is to understand, it's the last thing in that list, spot new patterns across the data. Because it understands all of the data that it's trained with, and we'll come to private GPTs later on in the presentation. It's able to spot patterns because it understands the whole volume of the data in a way that a human cannot possibly do. So in terms of kind of what AI can't yet do, it's the kind of things that humans are really good at. It's judgment, it's professional responsibility, ethical considerations, the kind of thing that comes from experience. One of my favorite quotes is that good judgment comes from experience and experience comes from bad judgment. You can't get around that. And you can try and train an AI to be experienced in the particular moment, but there are all sorts of things, all sorts of experiences which have formed any one of us. So this is something that AI can't do, but there is a big word, particularly in AI, that you have to bear in mind when people say, well, AI can't do that yet. Because all of this stuff, whether it's hallucinations or whether it's kind of dealing with experience, because that's what we're saying it can't do, there is going to be somebody on planet Earth who is trying to help AI to do that, if this is going to be a useful thing for it to do. But for now, this is where we add value to AI in a way that it does things that together we can do more than we can do with separately. So let's talk about prompts, because prompts is the way that you communicate with generative AI. One of the kind of the skeuomorphic, if you remember that concept from earlier, one of the skeuomorphic ways that people tend to do it is to sort of treat ChatGPT initially just like Google. They put in search strings, but that's not the same as a prompt. A prompt really is like dealing with an intern, where what you're trying to do is to kind of describe what you want the intern to do. And the intern has a certain level of intelligence, but probably not as much experience as you do. And therefore, you might kind of start with a description of what you want an intern to do. They go away, they do the work, they come back, and then you say, yeah, like that, only slightly differently. And you give them specific feedback, and then they go off and they do it again. That is how you should be treating ChatGPT. And you should also, in the same way as the intern, you shouldn't be taking everything that they give you, that it gives you as gospel. That's where your experience and intuition comes in. So it will help you to get away from the blank page, and it might give you 80% of the answer, but that last 20% really does have to come from you. Now, part of the kind of the challenge with anything, with any tool like this, is that you can buy a typewriter, but that won't make you Ernest Hemingway. You can even buy Ernest Hemingway's typewriter, but it still won't make you Ernest Hemingway. And it's the same with ChatGPT, which is that when you look at this screen, it doesn't really help you. There's no buttons. Well, there is buttons, but it's not like Excel or Word or something like that, where there's buttons for left justifying or centering or that kind of stuff. All there is that letterbox. And therefore, there's a certain kind of frustration, people like me saying, well, AI can help at every stage. Well, yeah, that's fine. But what do I actually ask it to do? And it can help at every stage when you're using different parts of that prompt quadrant that I put there before. So if we start with just going through a kind of an imagined process that I've kind of made up, but following this kind of these steps. So the first thing is preparing for the brief. Now, the way it should be is that there is a steel thread between what the client's commercial strategy is through the organizational structure, where the structure is strategy by other means, if you'll pardon me butchering that quote. And then from that organizational structure, you should end up with a bunch of jobs and job descriptions, which in an ideal world should be mutually exclusive, but collectively exhaustive. Now, that's not the way that things actually happen, because it's really, really hard turning something like that client strategy and that vision, the purpose, into the practicalities of a job that you can then recruit against. But this is the promise of generative AI, that it can kind of take something like client strategy and it can work through it. So just by way of example, the purpose for Stone and Chalk is to transform Australia into a sustainable technology-driven economy. So what I did, I'm going to take you through a bunch of prompts that I've done in preparation for this deck. And the first thing I did was to ask ChatGPT to imagine a future where Australia was a sustainable technology-driven economy. And you can see on the right-hand side, that's what it did. And it starts by 2050. Australia has transformed into a sustainable tech-driven economy. And then it talks about renewable energy and it talks about tech-driven economies and things like that. So the next thing I said was, okay, so given that, describe the role that Stone and Chalk played in creating and driving that future. And it did. Then I said, what strategy did Stone and Chalk follow to achieve this from 2023 to 2026? And it gave me that. And then I said, describe the organizational structure required by Stone and Chalk to deliver this strategy. And it gave me that. So what it's done is kind of, it's taken that initial purpose, it's extrapolated out, and then it's reverse engineered back to a structure. Now, as I said before, it's not necessarily 100% right. And you can imagine there's all sorts of scenarios and sort of ifs, buts, and maybes that will kind of take it in different directions. But nevertheless, back to that kind of steel thread from the client strategy all the way down to the job description, you can see that if we can get it to transform a strategy into a structure, into jobs, and that's something that humans can look at and say, is that right? Is that 80% right? And then change it, that becomes enormously powerful. So let's move on to that next stage. I'm just going to get rid of that poll from my screen. There we go. So still in preparing, write the job descriptions based on that strategy that I've given you. And you can see I put on the left-hand side based on that strategy and structure. But within ChatGPT, you don't have to do that because it's all within one conversation and it knows what you're talking about. It knows the various prompts and the conversation you've had with it up to now. So I can just say, write a job description for the marketing communications manager that's within that structure. Job description, I give it these kind of areas, give me job title, job purpose, etc. And on the right-hand side, you can see that's the job description it's given me. Again, 80% right, but 80% is so much better than 0%. And you can keep doing that. You can keep getting it to write more and more job descriptions. Then I might say, well, I've got to do an ad for that. And therefore, I need you to write the ad for Marketing Communications Manager. And there it is on the right-hand side. Then I might say, well, I also need to be doing some proactive searching on LinkedIn. So help me to write a LinkedIn search string, which is going to help me to find people who have the kind of experience that I need from Marketing Communications Manager, which have experience in startups and must be based in Sydney. So it gives me that information. Then I might want to write LinkedIn posts, which publicize this to people who are watching my feed, in which case I can ask it to suggest 4 posts and I can keep on asking it to generate more and more. Then I can say someone like the Professor Mark Ritson, who I'm sure won't mind me using his CV, where I can take his, what I did was to just take his experience from LinkedIn and copy and paste it into ChatGPT and say, based on that job description that you've wrote earlier, for the marketing communications role, assess suitability of this candidate, right? And there it is. It did exactly that. But Mark Ritson isn't right for this particular role. So I then need to write a feedback letter to Mark, with any luck, giving him some feedback as to why he didn't get the role. ChatGPT can do that. Write a polite letter to Mark Ritson, thanking him for applying for the role and providing feedback as to why he won't be selected. Then, once I've got a lot of CVs like Mark's, one of the things that I will want to do is to kind of summarize those candidate CVs, because I might want to be meeting with my clients, and therefore they're going to want to see those CVs. Now, whether the summary of that CV is fairly long, like this, I can define that. I can say to ChatGPT, summarize that CV in 100 words or in 200 words. And you can see I've said in my prompt, explain why he's a good candidate for this role. And you can see that at the bottom there. Then I might want to write an offer letter to Bob, and off it goes. So all of this stuff is, it's volume stuff. I suspect for this audience, everybody's tried to do this kind of thing, and it works, right? It's still fairly manual, but it's a lot less manual than writing all of these things by yourself from scratch, even from templates. And you can imagine doing this for a big restructure, where what you're trying to do is to kind of make it so that the jobs are consistent with the strategy. It becomes really powerful. But here's the thing. If recruiters and recruitment side can be using ChatGPT, then so can candidates. And they are. And, in a sense, would you really want to be hiring candidates who don't know about ChatGPT and aren't using it in their job search? So you can imagine, if you're a candidate, you will use ChatGPT in a similar way with those prompts. I'm not going to read out each one of those, but, optimize my CV for this job, write a personalized cover letter, give me 10 creative questions as to what I might ask an interviewer and what an interviewer might ask me. And I'll come to some examples later on. But this means that all of a sudden, it's become a lot more practical for candidates to make very specific applications for things that make the most of their experience. And this is, I guess this comes back to the diversity point, is that at the moment, the way that we've set up the system, it's there to sort of help us all manage the volume. So in terms of CVs, depends who you talk to, but a lot of the received wisdom is around get it onto one page so that it expresses, who and what you are in a very succinct way for the reader, which is fair because it's volume, right? But if we've now got something like ChatGPT, which can summarize that, then wouldn't you want to put anything and everything that you have ever done into some form of document, so that then ChatGPT has got more to work with when it's putting together an application for this particular job? So it could be that you hear a lot that many people, and I think a lot of women don't apply for jobs because they think they don't have the necessary experience for that role. And now ChatGPT can help them with that process, because they can say, well, I tell you what, it's not up to you to decide whether you have the experience or not. I will tell you the best version of your story, but you have to meet it halfway. You have to say, well, in this job, I did this, this, and this, and this. Now, up to now, that's been something that career planners might kind of help individuals to do, because they're looking at the whole kind of self and the whole past and things like that. But fundamentally, it then comes down to that one-pager CV, but that's no longer necessary. Now, all of that said, we're still at what they call an early stage of abstraction. So on the left-hand side, it's a famous picture of Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak when they were a member of the Homebrew Computer Club. And that's their first computer that they built when they started Apple. The Mac represented a higher level of abstraction. So when I showed you that screen of ChatGPT, where it was just the kind of the letterbox, that's a very low level of abstraction, because you then have to type in your prompt, and you have to know what precisely you need to type into that in order to get your outcome. So you can imagine over time, and I'll show you some examples of things which are starting to get to that higher level of abstraction, where we will get to is something that does look a lot more like Word and Excel with buttons, and they help you to use generative AI in a better way. And we're not there yet, but things are moving fast. So there are things that, for instance, like lead resumes where you just upload the resume and it will then produce something which is so much better, right? And which is adapted for application tracking systems and all of those things that mean that candidates can sometimes be rejected. Cover letters is something that a lot of people really struggle with. But again, you know, if you've got that job description and you've got the CV, AI can help you to generate as many cover letters as you like for as many roles that you want to apply for. Similarly, even interview preparation. This is from some people called Adzuma in the UK, where it will prep you for interviews with the interview questions that you might come across, but also critiquing the answers that you provide. Similarly, with job descriptions, this is an abstraction where it will help you to write the job descriptions rather than, as it says, cutting and pasting something in. When you're doing screening, one of the issues that people have with ChatGPT is that the size of the document that you can put in is actually quite small. But if you use a site like this, and this is called chatpdf.com, you can drop the PDF in there, and then you can ask it questions. So a couple of days ago, McKinsey produced a 69-page report on AI. And to avoid having to read all 69 pages, I dragged it into this site. And then it talked about, in the kind of the top summary, it said, we have identified 63 use cases. So I asked ChatPDF to extract those 63 use cases, and it did. So if you can do that with that kind of report, then you can do that with anything, whether that's an investor strategy presentation for your client. It could be job descriptions, it could be structures, it could be anything that you like. But it basically means that you can take huge quantities of documents and you can use generative AI to get you across them faster so that you get the best part of it. You get the summary of the best points. Something that we use a lot at Stone and Chalk is this thing called Otter. Now, there's a lot of things, or at least an increasing amount of meeting transcription software out there. Otter is just one example, but the transcription is excellent. And one of the things it does is it will join Zoom and it will provide you with a summary afterwards. You can see that on the right-hand side. In fact, you can actually send it to a Zoom call that you don't have the time to go to, or maybe you need to be in two places at once or something like that, and it will then deliver you a summary of that meeting afterwards, and you can search through it and you can say, tell me where they mentioned my name in connection with an action, for instance. Now, I was listening to a podcast a couple of weeks ago where somebody from Microsoft came. I think they worked in the future of work area, and they were talking about the ways in which they are infusing, they use this wonderful word, infusing AI into Microsoft products. And they talked about it in terms of Teams. Now, this is a Zoom thing, a Zoom screen, but the point is still the same. And when I say GPT tomorrow, literally, she said, in the next couple of months, they will have this type of functionality. And what she described is that AI will be listening to the meeting live, and therefore it will be aware of what's being talked about in the meeting. And on the right-hand side here, it will proactively offer suggestions, reminders, coaching to you personally, stuff that's relevant to you. So one of the things it might say is, the coaching is actually specific to you. You need to be saying more, or it might provide a reminder where it says, in my example here, don't forget in an email on the 3rd of April, you said you'd look into this for her. So you can imagine, obviously, the person who, in this example, only the user would actually kind of see this information on the right-hand side. And conceivably, everybody in the call would have their own Jarvis, which is giving them all of these kind of suggestions, right? And therefore, you can see that in terms of like an interview, for instance, it may be that the candidate and you as the interviewer would have these kind of prompts all the way through. Now, some people might call that cheating. but some people might think that that leads to a better overall experience and a better interview at the end, especially if this is something that people will then be using in their everyday. Because you can see that if you're being trained in a particular role, this becomes really, really interesting and really important, that it's the AI that's actually there and is training you in the moment. So what that does is it massively changes the talent equation. It means that people who are in the sort of the 80% of the bell curve, all of a sudden, like I said before, they become, it's the rising tide that floats all boats, because everybody is now in that top quartile. So does that actually mean that talent is hard to find, or does that actually mean that talent is everywhere? Because all of a sudden, what you're dealing with is something that looks more like a room full of supermen, right? But conceivably, it's not just people who all have the same approach to something and the same sort of cognitive processes. It actually means that everybody is a superhero, but in a very, very different way. So what that means is that from any number of perspectives, and it's not just recruitment, clearly, this is in terms of consumer, all sorts of things where AI will result in hyper-personalized experiences, something which is just for you. So I imagine that at some point in the very near future, the phone that we all have in our pockets will have that personal pilot, and it's telling you what you need to know based on what it knows about you, about your preferences, about what you need to learn in your job. So that means that in terms of kind of the way that individuals work, whether it's within recruitment or in all sorts of kind of areas, I think there are certain sort of careers like dentistry or driving instructors where you would want to be with a company for a period of time because that's when you're learning. But there comes a point where that sort of corporate infrastructure is not really adding value in the way that it used to when you started out. And therefore, there's almost a kind of an inevitability of moving to being a solopreneur, to running your own thing. Because all of a sudden, you can use GPT to screen huge quantities of volume. You can deal with all these interviews at volume. There's any number of things that you can do where previously you needed a lot of people in order to do that. But there is a fundamental problem with that. And it comes back to Mark Ritson, funnily enough, our earlier candidate. And he talks about something called the Sven problem. And the Sven problem is that Mark lives in Tasmania, and he, before COVID, his wife did yoga, and they needed a yoga tutor to come around to the house, and they lived in the middle of Tasmania somewhere, and there was only one guy called Sven who would actually come to the house. So he used to do that kind of on a weekly basis, and then COVID came along and he couldn't do that anymore. So he sent an email out to everybody to say, I'm now going to do yoga classes on Zoom. And when COVID left again, he realized that the worst part of his day was actually driving from one client to another in Tasmania. So he announced to everybody that what he was now going to do was just do yoga on Zoom. But then Mark's wife, when she started looking into it, discovered that there were all sorts of other people on a global basis who were also delivering yoga on Zoom, and they were a lot better than Sven. So Sven's problem is that he then changed his competitive set, where his competitive differentiator used to be the fact that he would actually drive between all of his customers, and he was there physically in Tasmania. So now he's in a completely different competitive set where he is competing with people on the other side of the planet who've got way more experience than he does. So the whole kind of solopreneur sort of experience may look attractive, but you have to be very careful because it changes your competitive set. So the last message here, significant opportunities available to early adopters. It's possible to kind of look at something like this, whether it's AI or generative AI, and think that this is a way off. But there was a survey that I came across just this morning from this site called Resume Builder, which Firstly, in terms of client-side recruiters, they said, which of the following best describes your company? On the left-hand side, we currently use AI interviews, which is actually quite a small percentage. But on the right, you've got unsure of company plans for AI interviews. But if you look at that part in the middle, we plan to start AI interviews this year. We plan to start AI interviews in 2024. This is a technology which is quite clearly in the plans for a lot of people in recruitment. That said, there are some challenges with that. They also ask which of the following best describes where AI interviews are best used in the hiring process. Now, 15% of those using AI interviews will take the decision without human input. So that means that in terms of kind of the last step in the process, that means that they're doing these AI interviews, but they're not expecting there to be any human in that loop. So they're preparing already to be able to do kind of AI-based interviews at scale. That said, 2 in 3 believe that AI interviews are going to increase hiring efficiency because yes, but the majority believe that AI is going to, there's a risk that they will screen out good people. So clearly there are some pros and cons in terms of kind of applying AI to recruitment, but at the same time, it's recognized that there is going to be definite benefits for doing so. So in terms of kind of where you might start with something like this, in terms of kind of experimenting, what we believe is that businesses should start thinking about building their own private GPT. And what that means is just like I talked about earlier with the kind of the plugins where you have ChatGPT going through the plugin sort of tunnel to Kayak and Expedia, there will be massive benefits to people in terms of building a private GPT that uses their data and allows them to interrogate that data, whether that's CVs or job descriptions, in a way that could help companies to see more opportunities, or it could offer opportunities for just basic retrieval, or allow give people outside of a company access to that IP. So how would you start? Now, essentially, there's 5 layers. So you might start with the general AI model, which is the ChatGPT. And what ChatGPT provides is that ability to talk to people, to be able to converse. But on top of that, as I said earlier, there's that risk of hallucination. So Bloomberg have released a GPT, which is based on financial data. And so that means that it's trained just on financial data. So it's so much better at answering financial questions than ChatGPT by itself, but it's still using that kind of interface, that conversational interface. Google have created something similar with medicine. So they have this thing called Google MedPalm 2. And what that does, it's trained on medical Q&A. And that means that it's when it took a medical exam, it got 85.4% correct against a pass mark of 60%. And that a normal GPT would be 50%. So actually training something on the specifics of a domain, like it could be a company, it could be in ways in which you would apply successfully for roles. That's where a GPT becomes massively useful. And so you could build a hyperlocal, as in your business, GPT. And there's a number of kind of applications on the market to do that. Obviously, you would need help to do that. But it is possible because that's where people believe is the major benefit to individual businesses to start with. You can then have operating systems like or API layers, like I said earlier, in terms of kind of those plugins that we talked about. And there's I think there's over 400 plugins which ChatGPT is now offering. A plugin is not your private GPT. What it is an API that allows you to connect to ChatGPT, and therefore it allows somebody to access your database rather than it just being a private GPT based on your particular business. So that's a kind of a bit of a difficult different application, but you can imagine in terms of a private GPT, it could be that Woolworths opens a gives access to all of the open roles that it has, or Goldman Sachs might do the same, or Michael Page might do the same. So it enables people to put into ChatGPT, I'm looking for this type of role. This is my experience. What kind of roles are out there for me? And GPT would then go through that plugin into those third parties, pull the necessary job description, then present them back to the user. And then right at the end, what you have is applications like Otter, which make the whole thing so much easier to use. Because essentially it's that point I said earlier about the levels of abstraction. Now, at the same time, there are clearly risks involved with doing this, because you can imagine if you've got candidates who can produce any number of very specific cover letters and very specific CVs for a job description, all of a sudden, the cost of doing that is close to zero, where it used to be something that applicants would have to spend a lot of time doing. And if on the other side, on the recruiter side, what you then have is robots who are assessing what comes in from the candidates, what you can end up with is just robots talking to robots, right? And not necessarily true and accurate reflections of the candidate. And therefore, how do you deal with that? Because it could be that all of the technology on both of these sides, on the candidate and the recruiter side, ends up with huge quantities of volume and just exacerbates the volume problem. So apart from that, something that's risks that you need to bear in mind, first of all, is that data risk, and you may well have heard of this in terms of sort of privacy. That you have to be very careful about what you put into ChatGPT, because if you can turn off their ChatGPT's ability to train it on your inputs. There's a button that you can press, or you can make it so that ChatGPT doesn't use anything from your IP domain. But you have to be very careful about the privacy of the data of the CVs that you're putting in if you haven't done those things. Secondly, the model and the bias, the data upon which GPT has been trained, unless you're really, really clear as to what that data looks like, that can result in biases that aren't going to be clear to you because the algorithm itself may not be aware either. So in terms of kind of the way all of these large language models have been trained, there are going to be inherent biases just because of the way that the data has been used. And so that's where a lot of the responsible AI stuff that you see is focused. Fraud at scale is kind of what I talked about earlier in terms of sort of robots talking to robots. How do you know the people who really do genuinely have the experience that you're looking for versus the people who are just, they've used GPT to just kind of tell a particular part of their story? And the last bit is that Stephen Schwartz guy that I told you about in New York, where he misunderstood the ways in which he should use ChatGPT safely and to keep away from stuff which is factual. And then lastly, what I wanted to do was just to kind of run through some sources that I thought you might find useful. One of the things that I find very useful is I get some daily emails and daily newsletters, which contain news on generative AI, but they also provide tips on prompts. So one of them is Prompts Daily. And if you take a photo of that QR code, it will take you to Prompts Daily and you'll be able to sign up for that. Another one is called The Rundown, which is similar, but it puts more of a focus on news, and it gives a really good rundown, pardon the pun, of all of the latest AI applications which have come out there. And there's some really great recruitment ones, which are it talks about. And the last one is a book, unusually, by this guy, Reid Hoffman. He's obviously one of the co-founders of LinkedIn, and he's an investor in OpenAI. And so he had access to GPT-4 6 months before the rest of us did. And he talks about his experience in this book, Impromptu. And he also talks about his vision and his ideas as to where this might take us. And it's a fantastic book, and I would recommend it to you. So hopefully, these are the key messages that I said we'd cover right at the beginning. Hopefully that's been useful to you. I think there's many questions for this, right? But I think key questions are, what does happen when the costs of application go to zero? Does that really result in kind of massive volume? And what else can you do? Forgive the typo. What else can you do if volume in recruitment is no longer an issue? And what I mean by that is, if GPT can handle a lot of the kind of the volume challenges that has been a kind of a part of recruitment up to now, what else does that release you to do in terms of sort of value add to a client? Now that that volume's solved, what does that mean? How does that, and this is the next question, how does that change the role of the recruiter, whether that's internal or whether that's agency? And lastly, in terms of kind of understanding AI and how it augments all of us, what can you and AI now do together uniquely? And at the moment, where we are, how you write those prompts and how you use ChatGPT can be unique to you and can be really, really powerful and differentiating. So last thing, in terms of kind of joining the revolution, I would encourage you to just start. Decide how you think it can help you. We can certainly kind of help you to workshop through that in terms of going understanding your business model to now and where that might take you. You might build a basic GPT. It's not very expensive. It's something that we can do quite easily, and then run some pilots and see where it takes you. And I think that would be an easy first step. So if you'd like to learn even more, by all means, messages in the chat. Hopefully you've been doing that through this presentation, or email Kim at kim.jolly. That's it. That's all I have. So Q&A, let's go to that. Many governments have already banned use of ChatGPT, so workers and managers don't even have a choice to utilize it. What will it take to make governments confident of AI's use of its data? That's a really good question. My understanding is that usually governments have banned it until OpenAI make some changes or reassure them that the data is safe and the data is being used in a particular way. And I think Italy banned OpenAI and now they have changed it. So I think there's an inevitability of that happening. And one of the things Sam Altman, I don't know if you saw, was in Melbourne last week, because he's doing this worldwide tour where he's kind of asking questions and listening to governments and what they need him to do in order to make it available so everybody has it. So I think that's, you have to remember, this was only launched back in November, right? And here we are in June talking about this stuff. So I think that's an excellent question. I don't have a really good answer, but I think people like Sam Altman are trying to find out what those answers are so that the 6.6 billion people that I talked about earlier do have access to this. With huge productivity gains possible from implementation of AI, how would you suggest senior people leaders go about influencing executive management to see the long-term benefit? Let's take that part of the question first. Well, first of all, you should ask me to come to your company and I will help the people leader to influence the senior executive management. I think everybody can use this. And one of the things in the Mark Andreessen article recently about how AI is going to kind of change everything, he talked about the concept of the CEO co-pilot, something that everybody will have that will be really relevant to them. And so I think this is something that everybody can understand how it can help them personally. And if they can understand that, then they can understand how it can help their business. But what we found is it's back to the skeuomorphic point. Just because you have access to the thing, the typewriter, as I said earlier, it doesn't necessarily mean that you kind of properly understand how you can question the assumptions of what it means for doing business differently. So that's where we can help. So that's why you should get in touch with Kim. Second part, given the prevalence of short-term thinking, it could be tempting for execs to simply keep doing the same, but cheaper by making teams smaller and reducing payroll spend. How do you influence against this thinking? Yeah, that's one particular route to go. I think it's interesting. I was listening to a podcast with a bunch of VCs, And they were talking about developers, for instance, because one of the things is that now that GitHub has this Copilot, it means that conceivably you need fewer developers. But they also said that, you know, one of the things that holds every startup back is that they have this massive long product roadmap and they never have enough technical resources. And therefore, if what that means is that the technical resources can do so much more, then that's what they will do. They won't get rid of the developers. So I think a lot of this will come down to the culture in a particular company, but also everybody within a company will need to make their case in terms of kind of, well, what else do we think this can do? And that's where we can help you to imagine, because it's going to be too easy to go back to the skeuomorphic thing and put metaphorically the camera in front of the theater stage. And so I think that's how I would kind of work with that, how I influence against that thinking. What OpenAI plugins are available now when using ChatGPT, and does access to OpenAI plugins require a ChatGPT Plus subscription or something else? It does require a ChatGPT Plus subscription. So when you go into it, it gives you an option of ChatGPT 3.5 or 4. You switch it over to 4, you press the button, and it gives you an option to either use plugins or to use the browsing plugin. And the browsing plugin allows ChatGPT access to the live web through Bing. It's not perfect by any means, but it's better than it kind of constantly saying, I've only got access to data up to September 2021. What about privacy? If we're putting candidates' information into ChatGPT, so therefore would have to have some sort of privacy issues around this information, is no longer in our domain, could be sent overseas somewhere and now on their server at ChatGPT and using that information for others. That's exactly the risk. One of the things that you can do, there is under settings within ChatGPT, there is a letter that you can download, and you can write the letter or the email to OpenAI, and you can ask them to take your entire domain, so, you know, stoneandchalk.com.au, and not use any of the data that comes from that domain. There's also, and I forget the application now, but there are applications which are redacting data before you before you copy and paste it into something like ChatGPT, which deals with this type of kind of privacy issue. So it's a really good point. I think there's also kind of all sorts of issues around copyright, which we don't have time to go into today. But I understand, especially with CVs and personal data and recruitment, this is a big issue. So it's not perfect. We haven't kind of solved it, but that's what you can do today. Do you think that AI could have the consequences of disincentivizing people from striving for better and getting ahead if everyone else is going to be able to use AI to piggyback off their work? The cynic might say, if the rising tide lifts all boats, why put the effort in if the rising tide will let me get there anyway? Yeah, I think the point is, maybe I didn't make this clear enough. If what it's doing is kind of, you know, I had that diagram where you have the sort of the talent bell curve, and then everybody's in the top quartile. What that does clearly is to then expand that top quartile into a new bell curve. So that's the bell curve that you're dealing with, albeit that everybody is now kind of at a higher level than they were before. So back to the point about the people, you won't lose your job to AI, but you'll probably lose your job to somebody who knows how to use AI. The stats at the moment, I think only about 12% of people in the States are actually using ChatGPT in their jobs on a regular basis. Now, I don't know whether that's because none of the rest of them know about it. I find that hard to believe. But I think it's got, like any technical tool, you know, like Excel, you know, when you come across somebody who really knows Excel really well, you know, the kind of person who goes in for Excel competitions, you know all about it. Whereas the rest of us just kind of use about 2% of Excel's functionality, even though it can steer satellites. I think it's the same sort of thing with ChatGPT. So I don't think anybody can rest on their laurels, but I do think that it's made it so that everybody is starting from a much higher point. And I think I am way over. Yes, I'm at 106. So Blake, I think we will leave it there if that's okay.
Thank you very much, Ben, and thank you all for attending this lunchtime webinar with Stone and Chalk. Hopefully you all received some very handy information. And as Ben mentioned, please do not hesitate to get in touch with us at our website, and one of us will be able to help you out with this topic. Thank you again for attending, and hope to see you at the next one. Thank you.